Chapter 2. Free Speech and Censorship. Freedom of speech is the bedrock of any truly free society. It's no coincidence that the very first amendment the Founding Fathers chose to enshrine in the Constitution was the protection of free speech. They knew that from their own experience and from studying the rise and fall of nations throughout history, that no society can remain free without the ability for citizens to speak their mind, change authority, and express their ideas, whether they're popular or not. The First Amendment doesn't just allow us to speak freely, it protects the soul of a nation. It protects the ability to think, to question, to debate, and most importantly, to challenge those in power. You see, our Founding Fathers understood that once you silence dissent, you open the door to tyranny. And that's why it came first. The right to bear arms, protected by the Second Amendment, was created as a safeguard for the first. Because if our ability to speak freely is taken away, all of our freedoms crumble alongside it. Look around at the world today. There are many countries where freedom of speech is not guaranteed, and the result is chilling. In nations where speech is restricted, governments are free to manipulate the public, control the narrative, and crush opposition. We've already seen it play out over the past century in countries where speech is tightly controlled, whether it's dictatorships that rose out of chaos or regimes that consolidated power by silencing dissenters. The absence of free speech leads to cultural unrest, suppression of the individual spirit, and the rise of authoritarianism. Without freedom of speech, a society loses its sanity, its collective sanity. There's a cultural balance that free speech preserves, because without the ability to openly discuss, debate, and even argue over issues that we face, we forget what's true and right. The frustration we feel today in America, from drugs and violence to depression and political division, often stems from the lack of open and honest dialogue. When we shut down debate, we stop growing as a culture. Censorship simply does not solve problems. It just pushes them down underground until they explode. Now, I understand that free speech has its challenges. I understand that. Bad actors can spread hateful, damaging ideas. But here's the thing. When we allow free speech, we also allow for the good to rise above the bad. Good people with good ideas always prevail in a free society. People aren't as easily fooled as some might think. In fact, it is precisely when speech is free and open that bad ideas are most easily exposed and defeated. The sunlight of free speech disinfects harmful ideas far better than censorship ever could. And here's the truth. In America, the vast majority of those calling for censorship and restrictions on free speech are typically the wealthy, powerful individuals who will never feel the consequences of these policies. The rich and the connected will always have access to platforms. They'll always have access to express themselves. They'll always have access to means to protect their interests, to protect their family. But what about the poor? What about the individuals whose only power, the only weapon, is their voice? When we allow the government to infringe on the right of free speech, we strip away the one tool that the poor and marginalized and the powerless have to defend themselves. Speech is a great equalizer. It's the one thing that the government cannot take away from someone, and it's the one thing that allows the powerless to change the powerful. If we allow the government, in the name of good intentions, or in the name of safety, to silence speech, we set a dangerous precedent that just cannot be undone. Think about it. What happens when the leaders that we trust today are gone, and someone else with less noble intentions takes their place? What if it's used by the very kind of evil leader that we fear the most? That's the danger that we're in. History is full of examples of governments that began by silencing bad actors, only to quickly turn that power against anyone who challenged them. Dictators rise when free speech falls, and it's a slippery slope that we simply cannot afford to tread. The problem with today's climate is that many of the people who are okay with censorship, they're okay with it because it's their side doing the censoring. But what happens when it's not? What happens when the tools that we give the government to control speech are used against us? When we create legislation that restricts speech, we are handing over the keys to future tyrants. It's that simple. I'll repeat. When we create legislation that restricts speech, we are handing over the keys to future tyrants. And that's the risk no free society should ever take. Yes, there are real challenges with social media and the spread of misinformation. Absolutely. But the solution is not government control. The solution is not to restrict the one thing that protects us from tyranny, our right to speak freely. Instead, we need to look at ourselves. Changing hearts and minds will never be achieved through censorship. It just absolutely will not, and never has been achieved this way. If people are being misled or manipulated, the answer is not to silence them. The answer is to engage them, to show them a better way. Communities, leaders, and local influencers are far more powerful in changing culture than any piece of legislation ever will be. The answer is dialogue, not silencing dissent. Freedom of speech is not just another right, it's the cornerstone of all other freedoms. Without it, nothing else matters. There's no free society without free speech, and we must be vigilant to protect it. We must remember that the moment we start restricting speech, even for what seems like a good reason, we are giving away a part of ourselves that we'll never get back. And finally, let's not forget the voice of the poor. Let's not forget the voice of the marginalized, the individuals who rely on their ability to speak out and challenge power. Let's not hand over the power to the government or any institution that once given will never return it. Instead of censoring speech, let's engage with it. Let's challenge it and show that good ideas will always triumph over bad ones. Because if we lose our ability to speak freely, we lose everything.